You sit in a room that does not announce itself. The light is low, not dim, but gathered, as if it has weight. It falls from no obvious source and rests on the wood of the floor, on the curve of the wall, on your hands where they lie still. The air has a faint scent of dust and old paper, the kind that carries memory without telling you whose it is. Somewhere behind you, perhaps, a clock ticks, but it does not measure time so much as it presses rhythm into the silence. I speak to you here because this is where listening happens when the ego loosens its grip. You are afraid of the empath you are meant to become. And this fear is not weakness. It is knowledge that has not yet found language. You have felt it in moments when another person's mood entered you without permission, when a room shifted and your body knew it before your mind could name it. You learned early that such permeability has consequences. To feel too much is to be exposed. To perceive too accurately is to risk being alone. So you adapted. You built a persona that could survive among others who do not wish to be seen. And you learn to blunt your sensitivity just enough to remain acceptable. But what you call empathy is not merely kindness or the ability to console. It is a psychological organ. It is perception that has not been filtered by convenience. It is the capacity to register the movements of the unconscious in yourself and in others. And because it reaches downward rather than outward, it terrifies the ego, which survives by clarity, boundaries, and control. The empath you are afraid to be is not the gentle listener you imagine. It is the one who cannot unsee. There is a moment, often forgotten, when this faculty first awakens. For some it comes in childhood, standing in a kitchen where voices are calm but the air is tight with unspoken resentment. The smell of boiled rice or soap lingers, and you know, without knowing how, that something is wrong. No one asks you what you feel. You are too young for that. Instead, you take it into yourself. The body becomes a vessel. The psyche learns to hold contradictions. Love and danger arrive together. And the child decides, silently, that awareness must be hidden if connection is to be preserved. From that moment, the shadow begins to form its particular shape around empathy. You repress not cruelty, but perception. You push down the parts of you that notice too much, feel too fast, respond too deeply. They do not disappear, they descend, and in the unconscious, they grow dense. They take on a life of their own. Later, when you meet people who are emotionally opaque, who deny what is obvious, who move through life armored against feeling, you feel inexplicable anger or exhaustion. You think it is because they are insensitive. In truth, they are carrying the image of what you have refused to become. Empathy, when denied, does not vanish. It turns against you. It emerges as anxiety, as fatigue without cause, as the sense that you are always one step ahead of disaster. You anticipate reactions before they happen. You edit yourself in advance. This is not intuition yet. It is survival. The ego uses your sensitivity as an early warning system, but forbids it from becoming conscious knowledge. You feel everything, but you are not allowed to know why. To become the empath you are afraid to be is not to feel more. It is to feel consciously. This distinction is everything. Unconscious empathy makes you porous. Conscious empathy makes you precise. But precision requires confrontation, and confrontation threatens the internal order you have relied upon. The ego asks, if I allow this depth of perception, what will I have to give up? The answer is always the same. You will have to relinquish the fantasy that you can belong everywhere. There is a scene I want you to hold for a moment. You are in a room with others, perhaps it is a workplace, perhaps a family gathering. Light reflects off glass or polished surfaces. There is laughter, but it arrives half a second too late. Someone speaks, and the words are correct, even kind, but something underneath them recoils. Your chest tightens, your breath shortens. You feel the impulse to smooth the moment, to translate, to soften what has not been said. This impulse feels moral, but it is psychological. You are attempting to repair the collective unconscious of the room so that no one has to face it. If you follow this impulse blindly, you become invisible. You become the mediator, the absorber, the one who carries what others refuse. This is the fate of empathy that has not been integrated into the self. It becomes service without sovereignty, and somewhere inside you, a quieter voice begins to speak. A voice you do not want to hear. Why am I always the one who understands? Why does no one meet me where I am? This inner dialogue is not complaint. It is the psyche signaling imbalance. Empathy without boundaries is self-erasure. Boundaries without empathy are sterility. The self requires both. Individuation does not ask you to amputate your sensitivity. It asks you to give it form. You fear that if you allow yourself to be fully empathic, you will drown. This fear belongs to an earlier stage of your life, when you had no choice but to absorb. The adult psyche has more instruments. It can reflect, symbolize, differentiate. But these capacities remain dormant if empathy stays unconscious. To bring it into awareness is to move it from the shadow into relationship with the ego. And the ego resists because it has learned that clarity costs love. Consider how often you have chosen confusion over conflict. How often you have told yourself that you might be wrong, even when your perception was sharp and grounded. This self-doubt is not humility, it is a pact. If I do not name what I see, I will not be abandoned. The empath you are afraid to be breaks this pact. They see and they remain. In dreams, this figure often appears disguised, sometimes as a watcher standing at the edge of a scene, sometimes as a wounded healer, tending others while bleeding quietly, sometimes as an animal with wide eyes, alert to every movement. These images arise from the collective unconscious, where empathy is not sentimental but archetypal. It is the function that connects the tribe to what is happening beneath appearances. Cultures have always both needed and feared this function. The seer is honored and exiled in the same breath. When you suppress this archetype within yourself, it does not die. It waits, and it waits with patience that can feel like pressure. You may notice it in moments of sudden clarity, when you realize exactly why a relationship failed, or why a certain success felt empty. The insight comes whole, not as a thought, but as a knowing. And just as quickly, the ego moves to dismiss it. Too harsh, too lonely, too much. There is another sensory memory I want to bring you into. Night, a window open just enough to let in cool air, the sound of distant traffic, softened by walls. You are alone, finally, and the body loosens. In this quiet, feelings you have avoided begin to surface, not dramatically, but with insistence, a heaviness in the stomach, a pressure behind the eyes. You replay conversations, not to judge, but to understand. This is empathy turning inward, and it frightens you because it suggests a different allegiance, not to harmony, but to truth. The psychology of empathy is inseparable from the psychology of individuation. To individuate is not to become isolated, it is to become whole. And wholeness includes the capacity to perceive what is emotionally real, even when it disrupts shared illusions. The empath you are afraid to be does not rescue others from their unconsciousness. They refuse to participate in it. This refusal often feels like betrayal of family myths, of social roles, of the unspoken agreements that keep systems intact. When you stop absorbing what does not belong to you, others may experience you as cold or distant. This is projection. They are encountering their own denied sensitivity, mirrored back by your containment, and because they cannot locate it within themselves, they attribute it to you as a defect. Here, the ego trembles. It asks whether becoming this person will cost too much. The question is not trivial. There is loss involved. You will lose certain forms of closeness that were built on your willingness to carry the uncarried. You will lose the comfort of being needed in that way. But what emerges in its place is something the psyche has been preparing for a long time. Authority, not authority over others, but authority over your own perception. When empathy is integrated, it no longer leaks. It informs, it guides action without overwhelming it. You begin to sense not only what others feel, but what is yours to respond to and what is not. This discrimination is the hallmark of psychological maturity. It is the difference between being flooded by the unconscious and being in dialogue with it. Yet, even as this possibility appears, another fear arises, quieter but deeper. If I see clearly, I cannot pretend. If I cannot pretend, who will I be with? This fear is ancient. It belongs to the part of you that learned connection through adaptation, and it deserves respect, not dismissal. The psyche does not abandon its strategies lightly. They once saved you. But there comes a point when a strategy becomes a prison. You may feel it now as a subtle constriction, a sense that your life is accurate but not alive, or alive but not truthful. The empath you are afraid to be stands at this threshold, not asking you to leap, but to stay present as the ground shifts. In analysis, one often encounters resistance at precisely this moment. The patient understands enough to change, but not enough to trust what comes after. So the psyche circles. Dreams repeat with small variations. Relationships replay the same dynamic with different faces. This repetition is not failure. It is the unconscious insisting that a door be opened consciously rather than burst through in symptom or crisis. I want you to notice how your body responds as you hear this. Perhaps there is tension in the shoulders or a tightening of the jaw, perhaps a warmth or a sudden fatigue. These are not distractions. They are communications. Empathy begins in the body long before it becomes thought. To become the empath you are afraid to be, you must first allow these signals to exist without immediately translating them into action. This is where many misunderstand the task. They believe empathy demands response. In truth, it demands containment, to hold what is perceived without rushing to resolve it. This capacity transforms empathy from a wound into a function of the self, and as this containment strengthens, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel less responsible for the emotional weather of others, even as you perceive it more clearly. The ego, sensing this shift, may attempt one last defense. It may tell you that this path leads to isolation, that sensitivity without accommodation is cruelty. This is a false equivalence. Cruelty denies feeling. Conscious empathy acknowledges feeling without surrendering to it. The difference is subtle, and it is learned through experience rather than instruction. You are not being asked to become harder. You are being asked to become more real, and reality, as the psyche knows it, is not always comforting. It is layered, contradictory, alive. The empath you are afraid to be does not float above this complexity. They descend into it, carrying light that does not burn but reveals. As you sit here in this room that seems to listen back, I want you to sense the presence of something larger than the personal story you tell yourself about being too sensitive. This sensitivity is an opening into the collective field. It is why you resonate with certain myths, certain images, certain silences. It is why you feel exhausted by surfaces and nourished by depth. These preferences are not tastes, they are orientations of the psyche. When you deny this orientation, life becomes performative. When you accept it, life becomes symbolic. Events are no longer random but meaningful, not because you control them, but because you participate in them with awareness. This shift does not happen all at once. It unfolds, often unevenly, as the ego learns to trust a wider center of gravity. There will be moments when you regress, when the old impulse to absorb returns with force. Do not interpret this as failure. The psyche moves in spirals, not straight lines. Each return brings more consciousness, if you allow it. The danger lies only in mistaking familiarity for truth. Listen now to the silence between my words. Notice how it presses against you. Not empty, but charged. This is the space where the empath you are afraid to be is already present, waiting not for permission, but for recognition. And as you begin to recognize it, not as a role, but as a function of your deepest nature, you may feel a subtle grief arise, a mourning for the years spent mistrusting this capacity, for the times you turned away from your own knowing because it threatened connection. And this grief, if you let it move through you without judgment, opens into something else, something quieter and more stable, as if a deeper layer of the psyche is preparing to speak, not in images or sensations alone, but in a form of understanding that does not yet have words. And as this understanding gathers itself, it begins to reshape the way you listen, the way you stand in a room with others, the way you inhabit your own inner landscape. And just as you sense this shift taking shape, before it can fully articulate itself, before it settles into anything recognizable or safe, it poses, hovering at the edge of consciousness, asking not to be grasped too quickly, but to be stayed with. breathed with, as the next movement of this transformation slowly begins to unfold. You remain with that hovering sense, resisting the urge to name it too quickly, because the psyche has its own tempo and it withdraws when hurried. In this pause, something important happens. You begin to notice that your fear is no longer sharp. It has softened into vigilance. Fear wants to stop movement. Vigilance watches movement. This is already a transformation. The empath you are afraid to be is not born from excess emotion, but from refined attention. Attention that does not collapse into the other, nor retreat into numbness. Attention that stays. This staying is the most difficult act for a psyche trained to survive by disappearance. To stay present when another's suffering arises without dissolving into it. To stay present when another's hostility emerges without defending prematurely. To stay present when your own insight threatens to isolate you. You have mistaken empathy for merger because that is how it first appeared in your life. As a child, you could not differentiate. You felt what was in the room as if it were inside you, because it was safer to feel than to confront. The adult psyche must unlearn this equation. Empathy does not require fusion, it requires containment. And containment is not a wall, it is a vessel. Think of a dream image that sometimes appears at this stage: a cup, a bowl, a well, something that holds. The unconscious speaks in these forms when the psyche is ready to transform receptivity into structure. Without structure, sensitivity becomes chaos. With too much structure, it becomes rigidity. The self seeks the middle way, where feeling is held by form. This is why becoming the empath you are afraid to be often coincides with a subtle strengthening of the ego, not its dissolution. A weak ego uses empathy to disappear. A strong ego uses empathy to orient itself within complexity. The fear you feel is not of empathy itself, but of the ego you might have to build in order to hold it. Notice how this challenges a familiar narrative. You may have believed that growth requires softening, yielding, becoming more open. In truth, growth here requires density, weight, a capacity to remain intact while allowing impressions to pass through you. This is why many sensitive individuals feel paradoxically drawn to disciplines that seem rigid from the outside. They are not seeking control, they are seeking containment. There is another scene, quieter than the others. Morning light enters a room at an angle, illuminating dust in the air. You are alone, perhaps with a cup of something warm in your hands. Steam rises, carrying a faint bitterness. In this stillness, you are not absorbing anyone else. You are simply present, and in this presence, you notice something unexpected. Your empathy feels clearer, not heavier. It no longer pulls you outward compulsively. It rests within you, available. This is the psychological difference between unconscious empathy and conscious empathy. One drags you, the other waits, and waiting is an act of trust. Trust that not every feeling requires immediate response. Trust that meaning will reveal itself if given time. Trust that your perception is not an enemy, but an instrument. Yet here the shadow re-enters in a subtler form. You may begin to judge those who lack this awareness. You may feel impatience toward their defenses, their denials, their emotional blindness. This impatience is the shadow of empathy. It is sensitivity turning into superiority. If left unexamined, it hardens the heart and isolates the psyche in a different way. The task is not to rise above others, but to stand beside reality as it is. Empathy integrated into the self does not need to correct or expose. It understands that unconsciousness has its own reasons. People defend not because they are weak, but because something in them could not survive without defense. When you truly grasp this, compassion deepens without becoming indulgence. There is a moment, often overlooked, when the empath begins to withdraw not from others, but from unnecessary participation. You speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need to translate yourself into a language that cannot hear you. Silence becomes a form of respect, both for yourself and for the limits of the other. This silence can feel frightening at first. It resembles abandonment, but it is not the silence of rejection, it is the silence of alignment. You are no longer scattering your energy in an attempt to maintain psychic equilibrium for everyone in the room. You allow disequilibrium to exist. This is a profound shift. It marks the point where empathy stops being reactive and becomes observant. In inner dialogue, a new voice begins to appear, quieter than the old self-doubt, steadier than the old anxiety. I can see this, and I do not have to fix it. This sentence, if it ever forms fully within you, signals a reorganization of the psyche. The ego is no longer enslaved to perception, nor is perception banished to the shadow. They stand in relationship, and relationship, not domination, is the goal of individuation. You may notice changes in your dreams around this time. Fewer chaotic scenes, more contained spaces, conversations that do not escalate into disaster, figures who listen. Even if they disagree, these are not predictions of outer life, they are reflections of inner structure. The unconscious mirrors the psyche's new capacity to hold tension without collapse. Outer life, however, may become more challenging as you stop absorbing what is not yours. Some relationships will strain. People who relied on your unspoken understanding may feel unsettled. They may accuse you of changing, of becoming distant, of losing warmth. In a sense, they are correct. You are losing a particular kind of warmth, the warmth of self-sacrifice disguised as empathy. This loss must be mourned honestly. Do not rush past it with philosophy. There is pain in realizing that some bonds were sustained by your willingness to disappear. Allow this pain to exist. It will not destroy you. It will clarify you. Empathy that survives this clarification becomes something rare. It is no longer entangled with the need to be needed. It no longer feeds on unconscious contracts. It stands on its own ground. From this ground, connection is possible again, but it is different. It is slower. It is selective. It is no longer guaranteed. The psyche resists this selectivity because it feels like judgment, but it is not moral judgment. It is energetic discernment. You are learning where your presence actually belongs. And presence, not effort, is the true currency of empathy. There is a temptation at this stage to retreat entirely, to mistake containment for withdrawal and solitude for integration. This is another defense. The empath you are becoming is not meant to vanish from the world. They are meant to engage it without being consumed by it. This requires practice, and practice implies error, miscalculation, return. You will sometimes overextend. You will sometimes close too quickly. The psyche learns through oscillation. What matters is that you remain in dialogue with your own experience, rather than handing authority back to old patterns out of fear. As you listen now, you may feel a subtle shift in how you are sitting, how you are breathing. Perhaps your spine feels more upright or your breath deeper. These bodily adjustments are not incidental. They reflect the psyche's attempt to inhabit itself more fully. Empathy, when integrated, changes posture. It changes how you occupy space. The room we are in feels different now. The silence has a texture. It is no longer waiting. It is accompanying. This is the quality of presence that the empath you are afraid to be naturally carries. Not intrusive, not withdrawn, attentive, and yet, just as this quality begins to feel familiar, another question stirs beneath it, less formed, more unsettling. If I no longer organize myself around others' emotions, what will guide me? What becomes the center? This question does not ask for an immediate answer. It opens a deeper layer of the work, where empathy begins to orient itself not only toward others, but toward the self as an organizing principle. And as this principle slowly comes into view, it challenges assumptions you did not know you were carrying about purpose, about meaning, about the role your sensitivity plays not just in relationships, but in the shape of your life as a whole. And as this realization begins to gather momentum, it does not announce itself loudly. It does not resolve into certainty. It simply presses gently from within, suggesting that empathy may not be a trait you possess, but a path you are already walking, even as you hesitate, even as you doubt. And just as this suggestion begins to take on weight, before it can settle into any stable form, it opens outward again toward another layer of inquiry that is only now beginning to reveal itself. That outward opening does not move toward answers, but toward orientation. The psyche is not satisfied with explanation alone. It seeks alignment. When empathy begins to orient itself toward the self rather than toward the emotional demands of the environment, a subtle reversal takes place. You feel less pulled by what happens around you and more guided by something that does not shout. This guidance is easily mistaken for withdrawal, but it is neither passive nor avoidant. It is centripetal. Energy returns to its center. The self, as you may sense it now, does not present itself as an image or a voice. It appears first as gravity. Certain situations feel heavier, others strangely light. Certain conversations drain you less than before, not because they are easier, but because you are no longer negotiating your existence within them. You stand where you stand. This is not indifference. It is placement. Empathy reorganized around the self becomes discriminating without becoming cold. It recognizes difference without needing to erase it. This is why, at this stage, you may feel a growing discomfort with roles you once occupied effortlessly. The confidant, the emotional translator, the silent understander. These roles were adaptive, but they were not chosen. They arose because your sensitivity made you useful in environments that could not metabolize their own affect. Now, usefulness loses its hypnotic pull, not because you have become selfish, but because you have become precise. You begin to notice when connection is reciprocal and when it is extractive. This noticing is immediate, somatic, a tightening, a dulling, or conversely, an unexpected ease. Even in difficulty, the body knows before the mind organizes reasons. At this point, many people attempt to return to old patterns out of guilt. The psyche whispers accusations. You are becoming distant. You are losing compassion. You are no longer generous. These voices often carry familiar tones, echoes of early authority figures whose love depended on attunement. Recognize this. The guilt does not come from the self. It comes from internalized relationships that equated empathy with availability. There is a danger here, subtle but real. In rejecting unconscious empathy, you may flirt with detachment as a defense. You may tell yourself that you are simply observing, while quietly withdrawing your emotional presence to avoid the tension of differentiation. This is not integration. It is a retreat into the intellect. The psyche feels the difference immediately. Life loses texture. Encounters flatten. You feel correct, but not connected. True integration keeps the heart open while refusing to bleed. This balance cannot be achieved through principle alone. It must be lived, misjudged, corrected, and it often unfolds through encounters that test your emerging center. Imagine a conversation where someone speaks from their pain and you feel it clearly, but you also see how that pain is being used to control the field. In the past, you might have rushed to soothe, to explain, to accommodate. Now, you remain present, but you do not move toward resolution. The silence stretches. The other grows uncomfortable. Something in you wants to intervene. You do not out of cruelty, but out of respect for reality. This moment is pivotal. You are allowing the other to encounter themselves without your mediation. This is an act of empathy deeper than consolation. It acknowledges the other as a subject, not an object to be regulated, and it acknowledges yourself as a center, not an instrument. The unconscious registers this shift immediately. Dreams may introduce figures who challenge you directly, not as threats, but as equals. You may find yourself standing in dreams rather than watching, speaking without apology, or listening without collapse. These images signal a rebalancing of inner authority. At the same time, an older fear may resurface, one you thought you had outgrown, the fear of being misunderstood, not disliked, but misseen. This fear cuts deeper because it threatens the meaning of your perception. If I see clearly and still am not understood, what then? This question cannot be answered by reassurance. It belongs to the existential layer of the work. Here, empathy reveals its final paradox. The more accurately you perceive, the less you can rely on consensus to confirm reality. You begin to live closer to what is, rather than what is agreed upon. This proximity can feel lonely. But loneliness here is not absence, it is space. Space is required for the self to speak, not in words, but in orientation. You begin to sense what is yours to do and what is not. Without justification, decisions emerge not from urgency, but from resonance. This does not make life easier in the conventional sense. It makes it coherent. The empath you are afraid to be lives in this coherence. They do not move quickly. They do not explain themselves endlessly. They trust the slow intelligence of the psyche, which knows that what is aligned does not require constant defense. This trust is hard-won. It grows from repeated experiences of staying with discomfort and discovering that something essential survives. There is a sensory quality to this stage that is often overlooked. Sound becomes sharper, but less intrusive. You hear what is said and what is avoided. Light feels more dimensional. Faces reveal micro-expressions you once noticed, but did not allow yourself to acknowledge. These perceptions are no longer overwhelming because they are no longer personal in the old way. They are information, not obligations. And yet, compassion deepens, not the compassion that rushes to relieve, but the compassion that can witness. You understand now that suffering does not always want to be fixed. Sometimes it wants to be seen without distortion. This seeing is rare. It is why truly empathic presence can feel unsettling to others. It does not collude with denial. As this understanding settles, another layer of the shadow may appear. Resentment, not toward others, but toward yourself, for the years spent betraying your own perception. This resentment can be sharp. It may manifest as anger at small things, impatience with familiar patterns, even a brief contempt for those who still live comfortably within illusions you can no longer inhabit. Do not moralize this reaction. It is part of the reckoning. The psyche is recalibrating its history. Allow the anger to speak inwardly, not outwardly. Listen to what it protects. Beneath it, you will often find grief. Grief for a life lived too sideways, too adjusted, too careful. This grief is not indulgent, it is restorative. When grief moves through rather than stagnates, it leaves behind clarity. You no longer need to prove the legitimacy of your sensitivity. You no longer seek permission to perceive. This is where empathy ceases to be an identity and becomes a function. You are not an empath. You are a person whose perception includes emotional reality as part of the field. From this position, you may notice a shift in how you relate to conflict. You do not avoid it, but you do not dramatize it. You sense when engagement will deepen understanding and when it will only entrench defenses. You choose accordingly. This choice is not strategic in the social sense. It is instinctive, but refined. The psyche, sensing this maturation, begins to offer new images. You may dream of standing at a threshold, not barred, but waiting, or of holding a light that does not illuminate everything, only what is immediately present. These symbols reflect a trust in partial knowing. Empathy no longer demands total comprehension. It respects mystery. This respect is crucial. Without it, empathy becomes intrusive. With it, empathy becomes ethical. You understand that not everything perceived must be spoken, and not everything felt must be shared. Silence becomes a form of care. Now, as you sit with these movements, another question may arise, quieter than before, but more decisive. If this is who I am becoming, how do I live this in the world without retreating from it or being consumed by it? This question does not belong to theory. It belongs to practice. Practice begins not with dramatic changes, but with small refusals, refusing to over-explain, refusing to absorb unspoken hostility, refusing to anticipate needs that have not been expressed. Each refusal returns a fragment of energy to the center. Over time, these fragments accumulate into presence. Presence changes how others respond to you, often before they understand why. Some will lean in, sensing something grounded. Others will pull away, feeling exposed. This sorting is not something you orchestrate. It happens naturally when empathy is no longer used to stabilize the environment at the cost of the self. As this sorting unfolds, you may feel moments of doubt. Am I becoming rigid? Am I losing warmth? These doubts deserve attention, but not obedience. Warmth that depends on self-erasure is not warmth, it is compliance. True warmth has boundaries. It radiates from a center. And so, as the empath you are afraid to be becomes less a future possibility and more a present orientation, the work shifts again. It moves from internal differentiation to lived alignment. This movement is slower, less dramatic, and often less narratable. It does not announce milestones. It reveals itself in how you enter rooms, how you listen, how you leave conversations unfinished without anxiety. You may not yet have language for this way of being. That is appropriate. Language will come later, if at all. For now, the psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper axis, one that does not ask whether empathy is safe or dangerous, but whether it is integrated or split off. And as this axis steadies, it begins to support a new relationship to purpose itself, not as a goal imposed from outside, but as a direction emerging from within. And just as this direction begins to be felt, not as urgency, but as pull, before it clarifies into any image of what your life might look like, it invites one more descent, one more inward turning, where empathy is no longer only about others or even about the self as a concept, but about the psyche's relationship to meaning. And this descent, quieter and deeper than the others, is where the final fear often waits. Not the fear of feeling too much, but the fear of allowing your perception to shape the very structure of your life. A fear that now begins to stir, asking to be met. That final fear does not arrive as panic. It arrives as hesitation, a subtle delay when action would naturally follow insight. You sense the direction, but something in you lingers, as if waiting for an external sign that will never come. This hesitation belongs to the deepest layer of adaptation, where your life was shaped not by what you perceived, but by what was permitted. To allow perception to shape the structure of your life is the last threshold of empathy. Up to this point, empathy has reorganized your inner world, your relationships, your posture in the presence of others. Now it asks something more consequential. It asks whether you will let it determine where you place your time, your loyalty, your creative energy, your silence. This is where empathy ceases to be psychological only and becomes existential. The psyche knows this cost instinctively. It knows that if you follow what you truly perceive, certain paths will close, certain identities will no longer be sustainable. You may sense this in a faint mourning for futures you once imagined, futures built on accommodation, rather than alignment. This mourning is not a mistake. It is the psyche withdrawing its investment from lives that were never fully yours. There's often a dream at this stage of leaving a familiar place without drama. No pursuit, no catastrophe, just departure. You pack lightly, you know what you are taking, you know what you are leaving. When you wake, the feeling lingers not as sadness, but as gravity. The unconscious has accepted the necessity of the movement before the ego has found courage to follow. Empathy, when fully integrated, does not ask you to sacrifice yourself for others, nor does it license indifference. It asks you to become answerable to what you know. This answerability is quiet. It does not seek validation. It does not explain itself in advance. It moves when movement is required and rests when rest is true. At this level, the old fear returns one last time, transformed. If I live this way, will I still be loved? The psyche does not answer this question directly, because it is poorly formed. Love that requires blindness is not love, it is dependence. Love that survives clarity is rarer, but it is real. And real love does not demand that you amputate perception to belong. You may notice now that your empathy has a different texture. It is less emotional and more luminous. You feel into situations without losing shape. You recognize pain without absorbing it. You sense deception without needing to expose it. This restraint is not moral superiority. It is psychological hygiene. The world does not reward this immediately. In fact, it may seem to ignore it, but the psyche does not measure success by recognition. It measures coherence, and coherence produces a distinct form of strength, a strength that others feel even when they cannot name it. This is why the empath you are afraid to be is often mistaken for someone intimidating, not because they dominate, but because they do not yield where yielding would violate reality. They do not argue with illusion. They simply do not inhabit it. This absence can feel like judgment to those who depend on shared denial. Yet within this firmness, there is a deep gentleness, a gentleness that does not intrude, a gentleness that allows others their own tempo, their own defenses, their own awakenings or refusals. You no longer feel responsible for carrying what does not wish to be carried. This release does not harden you, it frees you. There is a final sensory scene I want you to enter, not as image but as atmosphere. Late afternoon, light slanting low, turning edges gold, the air cooler now, carrying the smell of earth or distant rain. You are walking, not toward anything urgent, simply moving. Your steps are unforced. Your breath matches them without effort. In this movement, you are neither scanning nor retreating. You are present. This presence is not dramatic. It would not make a story worth telling, but it is the quiet ground from which a life aligned with perception grows. Empathy here is no longer something you do. It is how you are oriented toward reality. From this orientation, meaning does not have to be constructed. It emerges. You notice which conversations nourish and which deplete, which work clarifies and which fragments, which silences feel alive and which feel empty. You choose accordingly, not perfectly, but honestly. Honesty is the final fruit of empathy, not honesty as confession, but honesty as congruence. Your inner and outer movements begin to correspond. This correspondence reduces inner friction. Energy that was once spent managing dissonance becomes available for creation, for thought, for rest. The psyche relaxes into this alignment. Symptoms soften, dreams become simpler. Not because life is simpler, but because the unconscious is no longer shouting to be heard. It trusts that you are listening. And now, if you sense back through everything that has unfolded here, you may realize something quietly decisive. The empath you were afraid to be is not a future version of you waiting to emerge. It is the organizing principle that has been attempting to orient your life all along. The fear was never about becoming something new. It was about ceasing to betray what was already true. There is no final instruction to give you, no method, no promise. The psyche does not work that way. It offers orientation, not guarantees. What remains is a simple, difficult fidelity to notice what you notice, to feel what you feel without collapse, to act where action is yours and refrain where it is not. This fidelity will not make you universally liked. It will not protect you from loss, but it will give you something more sustaining than approval. It will give you an inner continuity, a sense that your life, in its particular shape, is being lived from the inside rather than negotiated from the edges. The room grows quieter now, not because the words have ended, but because they are no longer needed. What matters has already begun to move in you, below thought, below identity, in the slow intelligence that has always known how to guide you. If you let it, and as you sit with that intelligence, without rushing to define it or claim it, simply allowing it to settle into the texture of your being, you may find that the fear which once guarded the threshold no longer blocks the way. It stands aside, transformed into attentiveness, as you step forward, not into certainty, but into coherence, carrying with you a form of empathy that no longer asks whether it is safe to exist, because it has finally found its place at the center of who you are.